Yeah, that's fascinating. You know, in 1997, there was a strike of the Neptune Jade. Peter, I don't know if you heard of that one, but the Neptune Jade was a ship that sailed from Liverpool in London. And workers there, I think it was under the Thatcher regime, it might have been a little bit later, were trying to organize a union. And the ship was loaded and sailed with non-union workers. It came over to the West Coast. And a boycott of that ship was initiated by local and IWW. And that ship went on to try to dock at other ports of call up and down the West Coast, as far north as Bellingham, Washington. I think it went even to Vancouver. Nobody unloaded. It then had to go across the Pacific to Japan. It wasn't unloaded there either. Internationalism is so critical in making forward progress, even locally. I think to have an international perspective is critical. Gives us a different perspective, an important one, solidarity. The ship ended up in the scrapyard because it couldn't be unloaded anywhere, and the owners wanted to get rid of it. So, victory for the working class. All right, we're moving into the, again, question, answer, comment period. If the speakers would like to come up, nobody can substitute for Mary, of course. Although there is a Mary in back. Mary, you want to give it a shot? Yeah, let's not forget Mary Teresa's wonderful contribution as well. And she also, too, has an article in our booklet here. And I think it's a wonderful contribution to understand the necessity and the legacy of women in not only the LWU, but in the labor movement in general. Very critical. So, at any rate, other comments, questions about any of this? Again, take some time to think about it. I want to call on somebody who's not spoken yet. Yeah, go ahead.
Peter, I think in your book, Wildlies on the Waterfront, you do a great job with kind of explaining and fleshing out the demise of local aid in the early 20s. And it was that lockout that did it, right, in the end. But if you can speak more about some of the other forces at work, you made reference to it, right, but more detail about it. Like, for example, I know Great Migration kind of accelerated in 1918, 1919. And if I remember correctly, part of what you were talking about in the last couple chapters was how local aid was unable to kind of harness those workers. And there was a surplus of labor in the Philadelphia waterfront. And when you have surplus labor, the forces are against you, right, to be able to continue to organize and bring them into the union. And that, I think, played a critical role, right? So if you can explain more fully about...
So you did a great job, it was A+. You know, like, if you have no experience with industrial work or really sort of wage work, well, you might actually be thankful to your boss that your boss hired you, right? Like, and so as thousands of Southern blacks move in from really peasant conditions, right? Jim Crow sharecropping conditions where they're powerless and they're moving into industrial cities. This is not unique to Philadelphia. This is Chicago. This is Cleveland. This is other places. Southern blacks have zero experience, right? They are pre-industrial peoples, right? Like, I mean, and so you know, what's a union, right? Like, I don't know what a union is, right? Then you have to tell me what's socialism, right? Like, and so Southern blacks who were immediately being hired on during the wartime when there was actually more work, right? And so there's the workforce inflates during the war, right? It's not surprising that these people had sort of no experience. The blacks who had been on the waterfront for years were the leaders of the union, right? Like, but newcomers have no experience whatsoever with wage work, right? Let alone with unionism or economic sort of radicals like socialists. How do you educate and organize, right? Well, it takes some time, right? Like, and so that is one factor, having essentially part of the workforce who isn't as committed to the cause, right? Like having to sort of take the benefits that the union has gained, i.e. good wages, a relatively, fair hiring system, etc., right? But might falsely presume it was the employer who had provided those things. How many workers do I know who actually think the boss is just kind and gives health insurance because they're just generous people, right? Like, and so, that's one factor. Another factor, as you know from my book, which I didn't highlight here, was, the Communist Party emerges and sees the IWW as likely to recruit into the newly created Communist Party, right? This happens also in many other countries, where as the communists are trying to build up a global political organization, looks to other leftists in order to try to, the film does a very good job of this. If I had been a Wobbly in 1917, I might have become a communist too, right? Successful revolution, right? And so, the Wobblies, some Wobblies willingly joining the communist. Many choose not, right? Actually, I'm doing some research on this now. It's fascinating in 1920, 1921, really, when globally this is happening in many countries. Right? These sorts of essentially this competition, right, between what might be seen an anarchist syndicalist left and a communist left. And ultimately, we know what happens. The communists are able, through a variety of means, to essentially sideline anarchist and syndicalist left. Often through repression, right? That's the first group that Lenin goes after in the Soviet Union, right? Are sort of the anarchists and the syndicalists. In the United States, right? They also are using these often subversive tactics to weaken the Wobblies. And Philadelphia is one example, right? Of where, again, the evidence is sparse, right? You could interpret it, I'd probably guess, in more than one way. But essentially that Wobblies are accused of basically betraying the Russian Revolution by loading weapons for the anti-communists in the Russian Civil War, for the whites. And without any evidence of this, but nevertheless, the National suspends local aid for not being loyal to the global cause. That weakens local aid in a time when that of it is already weakened by the wartime repression. The fact that they would suspend their largest local strikes one as illogical, but nevertheless that occurred, right? And so, I'm inclined to believe in sort of a communist sort of subversive efforts as playing a role, not the only role, right? In sort of the weakening of local aid, that combined with sort of economic changes, racism, as well as sort of rivals from the AFL and hated employers who hate the IWW. There's a bunch of forces in play, right? That weakened local aid in 1920 through 1922, I suggest. After the fall of the Soviet Union, many of us wanted to do more research in Soviet and communist archives. I've never been to Russia, but the Library of Congress has Communist Party records. And I never found anything. I looked to see, was there in fact something going on in 1920, 21? Maybe, right? They just, if so, I have never found a paper trail, right? But I still actually believe that. And Ben Fletcher believed that, right? Far be it for me to question him. Fletcher believed that essentially it was a communist who basically weakened local aid in 1920, 21. I'm inclined to agree with him.
Interesting. My understanding, though, as I do recall, that after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was from afar in Moscow under Bolshevik leadership that they mandated the CPUSA to integrate their own Communist Party locals. So that was an example of perhaps an international perspective looking in and providing a good corrective on a Communist Party gone the wrong way. But this would have been the early 20s.
Right, so actually
Before,
the Communist parties, even in 1919, 1920, by the late 20s, it is the International that's basically telling the CPUSA, you need to actually focus more on organizing African Americans, right? So in the mid-20s, after the subject of my particular research, is when the CP is in this period of flux. The Communist Party becomes actually the best white majority organization when it comes to fighting racism by the 30s, I would say. But I don't think they were targeting locally because it was black majority. I think they were just wanting to basically weaken the IWW because the IWW was unwilling to play with the communists, right? And this has, like I said, there's interesting things going on at different conventions, right, in Moscow, where they're trying to organize peoples from around the world, including the syndicalists and anarchists in countries visiting for what was called the Comintern, the Communist International, right? and then the prop intern, which was the Red International Labor Unions, which was they were trying to create a quasi-non-communist international labor federation, even though it was actually controlled by Moscow. But they were trying to put a sort of a non-communist face on it, partially in order to attract unions like the IWW that were skeptical. Right? So the Red International, as it was called, labor unions, was, and while we sent delegates, right, so they were actually participating in sort of flirting, you might say, and there were still splits in the IWW over this. Right?
Any other comments, questions? Yeah, I'm back.
I guess it's a question as well as an observation. You talked a lot about how the media, or the role the media played in sort of its propaganda efforts against the union, and equating them with being in treasonous efforts with the Kaiser, which is I find ridiculous. But drawing the line to the present time, I mean, had they had social media at their disposal, I mean, it would be just incredible just to think what they would do with that. Also, given the fact that we're losing the information war as it's being done, and fake news and all of that, where do you see the opportunities as well as the dangers with where things are at now, the opportunities, the parallels with that time and the present time with the technology that we have at our disposal, but also the propaganda that's been going on at the same time now and back then. Am I making sense?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, and I can give you one example of how social media can be very effectively used by organizers. I witnessed this in 2014. I was in the San Francisco Bay Area doing research, and have a lot of friends in the Bay Area. And Local 10, the union, the dock workers, the union that represents Bay Area dock workers, was collaborating with civil society organizations to protest against the Israeli assault on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, right? Like this became known as Block to Vote, right? Where Israeli-owned shipping line called ZIM, Z-I-M, had regular service to the Bay Area, to Oakland, right? And activists basically are going to throw up community picket lines in front of the waterfront, and with the hope / belief that the local members in Local 10 would refuse to cross a community picket, right? Like, and there was already foreknowledge of these events. There were some members of the union who actually had been collaborating with these civil society groups in advance, right? Like and so the company knows this, right? Like that this is sort of right now there's 1,000 Palestinians being killed, right, in the Gaza Strip, right? The ships coming in, they're coming into the Bay Area, which is, I would suggest, the most radical metropolitan area we've got, right? Could be better, but everything could be worse, right? Like, so coming into Oakland, right? Unions collaborating with basically these Arab American organizations and some other civil society groups, right? Ship comes in, right? Huge picket, so like coming in. Union says we're not going to cross this picket. Our health and safety would be at risk. It's not our job, basically, to sort of try to cross a picket line that they know is going to exist, right? And so that's in their contract, right? So they can invoke health and safety, which is no secret, right? The bosses know it, the workers know it, the community knows that health and safety has been used more than once, right, to stop work, right? Like, so ship leaves, right? Port, docks, is unable to sort of unload, right? Leaves, sails out into, actually leaves, goes underneath the bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, circles around, comes back, right? They were trying to, essentially confuse the activists, right? Goes to a different pier, right? Where's the media, right? Like, so Twitter, right? Like, all the activists were following the same Twitter account, and they were sending updates to people, anyone who could choose to follow, right? Would be able to sort of get the most recent updates, right? Far better than Facebook, because Facebook's a little clunkier, right? And you have to be friends with someone. It can be harder to sort of really use Facebook as an organizing tool, but Twitter is sort of wide open, right? Like, and so they used Twitter in this very clever way. I never witnessed it. I joined Twitter because I watched this happen, right? Like, so that basically they were able to share information, organizers, to whoever wanted to basically follow that account, right? To then show up at the right pier when the ship came back another time, right? And so that's an example of how social media can be used, right? For, well, any organizing, right? It could be a progressive or a conservative cause, right? But I mean, it's the technology we got. You're smart to use it, right? Donald Trump's smart to use Twitter, right? He can communicate and he can avoid, in my opinion, anyone who wants to control his voice. If you follow him, right? And so millions of people follow him, right? And so you may not like it, but it's a very powerful tool, right? And so it can be used, I guess, in various ways. Yeah. But I think that activists don't use these for their own peril. In Durban, another port I studied, in 2008, a Chinese ship came in loaded with weapons that was intended for neighboring Zimbabwe, which was in the middle of a violent election cycle. Dock workers in Durban used text messaging, right, for the same reason. They basically were quickly sharing information so that when this ship came in full of weapons, they said, we are not going to work this ship because these guns are going to be used to kill our fellow workers in Zimbabwe, who we support, right? That's sophisticated technology, text, but nevertheless also very effective. Sophisticated is maybe the wrong word. That's not new, technology can be a great assistance to organizing.
Oh, I don't have much to add to that. I think that's right. I guess the only thing I would add is an addendum to it. When I look back on what happened to the Wobblies in the teens and 20s, in one sense, they didn't have a chance. But what chance they had was rooted in a depth of belief and conviction on their part, which was in turn based in something that I think many elites found most threatening about the Wobblies. They aspired to be an educated, thinking man's workers' organization. As many of us know, their halls all over the country back then featured libraries, not filled with trashy literature, which was common in the day. In fact, their publications were often contemptuous of that, but rather with the works of, the likes of Marx for sure, but Voltaire and Herman Melville and people of those sorts. I think that gave them an advantage in this otherwise unequal conflict. An enormous advantage. At the same time that it made them enormously threatened because they were not, by all appearances, sheep being led by more educated leaders. They were sometimes charged with being that, but more often than not, they were understood to be something more threatening because they at least aspired among themselves to understand the world for themselves, the sort of decentralization of their ideology and the production of their ideology. And that too relates to things like how you deal with propaganda. The first weapon against propaganda is having the ability to understand the world yourself. And they at least aspired to that.
If I might, without abusing my role as a chair, Peter quite well pointed out how social media can be used to affect working class interests in a positive way. I think the other thing the IWW local represents on the West Coast is about as close as we can get in modern 20th century to a sort of a kind of dual control, of the workforce. They're a very strong contract. They have the health and safety clause, which I was fortunate enough to be part of both the Ned Lloyd Kimberly. You probably remember that boycott of that ship. That was back in 1981, which 81? 84, I'm sorry. Well, at any rate, but one which, by the way, Nelson Mandela recognized when he came to Oakland to speak. He mentioned the importance of that strike in supporting the anti-apartheid movements. And I believe health and safety was also invoked in the boycotting of that ship as well, which did not get unloaded as well. Actually, it got unloaded all except for the cargo from South Africa. And then again, I believe in the Neptune Jade incident, the health and safety clause was invoked. But also, in support of Mumia Abu Jamal. You also know they may have a clause for their birthday, but they also have a clause that says they can take another day off pretty much any time they choose.
So once a month they can have a stop work meeting where they stop their shifts in order to have a meeting.
There you go. And what they did, they used that to support Mumia Abu Jamal. And so what they have done is they have shown how strikes can become political as well as not just economic, moving beyond economic issues. And it's a wonderful example of how strong that union is. And why is it that strong? Only because it's had radical communist small c, actually capital C with Harry Bridges starting out. I mean, you know, he's got his problems, you know, we have his critique of him, but some of us do. But nevertheless, it was part of that history that it came out of the left. And that's why the IWW has the strength that it does today. And it's still, as compromised as it may be, it still is a beacon for those of us who are seeking to form unions and others who have them but could strengthen them, with a recognition that you know, we want to have a chance to call strikes for political reasons, not just economic. So to make that point, yeah.
I noticed that in the 1917 period, when they said that intertwining of corporate power with the state power, passing the laws that cracked down on the lobbies. I'm wondering, today there's a move afoot to amend the Constitution to clearly state, counter to certain Supreme Court decisions, to clearly state that only human beings are persons, corporations are not persons, therefore they're not protected by the Bill of Rights. And corporate money is not free speech and therefore can be regulated. Now, if that movement were successful, what is your opinion of what effect that would have on organizations like the Wobblies and the labor movement?
Maybe we should let the lawyer talk.
Well, I mean, I mean to be glib, but I'm a firm believer that that rights are what you use to effectuate power that you have, that they don't actually arrogate to you any power, or diminish it for that matter. And I'm skeptical that such a thing would pass, except, and this is a particular answer to your question, as something that might substantially limit the rights of people who don't have power, which would be labor unions, right? Now, we talked earlier today about whether unions should continue to serve as unrewarded or unrequited lobbyist agents of the Democratic Party. Maybe if they were limited in that role, that wouldn't be necessarily a bad thing. But I am skeptical of these measures to limit institutional financing of elections, because the one thing you can rest assured of is if they limit anyone, they'll limit unions before they limit corporations. But I also think that, and maybe this is a criticism of my own work, I'm not shy about doing that. I just wonder in general about whether, at the end of the day, what matters with unions, the IWW, ILW, whoever, is how much power you have on the ground. And that's a difficult thing to measure, but it's a different thing than looking at where you stand under the law, for instance. So the comments earlier about boycotting these ships intrigued me because, as I think my colleagues, comrades on the stage know, as I'm sure they know, the labor law is very, very tricky to navigate on questions like that. You could very easily get a secondary boycott charge against you, which includes civil damages and an injunction, just like that, boom, and an unfair labor practice charge. Okay. One way ILW gets around it is by these, pleading health and safety. It's not because we're strictly opposed to, we have a political grievance with a secondary party. It's because we have a legitimate concern protected by our contract. But that illustrates just how difficult it can be to navigate the law. And it's more difficult for unions to do it than for employers. They violate the labor law all the time and nothing happens. I shouldn't say that, that's an exaggeration, but very often the consequences of doing so are outweighed by the advantages. While as with unions, being weaker in that relationship, violating the law can be catastrophic.
But
Right,
the
right.
laws
Cool.
are so greatly influenced by corporate power
Yeah.
that intertwine with the state. If that corporate power were less, because they're no longer persons, don't you think that would have a beneficial effect?
I agree with you up to the point if they were persons. If that corporate power were less, then things would be different.
Wouldn't their corporate power influence in the government be less?
That it begs the question whether you could get such a limitation imposed on people who already have enormous power, and whether if it were enacted in law, the law wouldn't be eviscerated. I mean, the labor law is a laboratory of laws enacted, sometimes, often never enacted, but even when they were enacted, to the apparent benefit of labor, being completely eviscerated in short order. The Clayton Act in whatever year that was, but in 1914 was completely emasculated by the courts. The Norris-LaGuardia Act, even the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act. So I'm not disagreeing with your sentiment at all. I just am skeptical that the law has a sovereignty independent, or that much independent of corporate power to start with. That it would never be really at odds with corporate power. I'm not saying that could never happen, I just think it very seldom happens in a sustained way.
Well, and it would remain for that political opening, if, let's say in your scenario that it did take place, it would remain for the organized working class to take advantage of it. Without that, sans the organization of the working class to take advantage of that, and then take the leadership, it's not worth a whole lot, you know. Because there's often, you know, it's bourgeois legislation. It's bourgeois legislation. Unless the working class can run with it and achieve gains upon it, then it just remains as law on the books. You know, famous person once said the paper will take anything that's written on it. You know, it remains to be enforced. It remains to be taken advantage of. Anybody else from the audience? Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier about how having the right to work could be beneficial. If I understood you correctly, you were saying only in the sense that it might revitalize or help revitalize movements like the IWW. Is that what you were getting at, or did I misunderstand?
Or maybe just open the door to a different kind of unionism consistent with some things IWW has done. I mean, IWW doesn't have a temple across from the Dirksen building in Washington, D.C. That's funded with union dues, and nor does it has it ever spent $250 million in an election cycle. That's union dues. That's what these people are protecting, alongside of their ability to keep the lights on in their local homes. I don't discount the importance of the latter, but I do question the importance of the former. In addition to that, as some of you know this, some organizers point out that one thing Right to Work does is it takes off the table one of the most important arguments against signing a union card. You're going to make me pay dues. Mm-hmm. No, I'm not going to make you pay dues. I can make you pay dues in a Right to Work state. That's perverse because then you've still got to represent that same person, and that leads to the other point I raised. A lot of people in labor law and labor organizing nowadays are looking with renewed interest and optimism in non-majority union representation. That has some impediments in the law, but the law isn't as clear as some people think on that issue, where you could have a situation where you only represent the people in the unit who are members of the union and presumably who are paying dues. But I don't want to occupy too much of the discussion, but that's what I had in mind. And I'm not saying dispositively that would be a great thing. I'm just saying it's a more complicated issue than it's sometimes presented.
Okay, great. Yeah, over there.
Not to get into debate on the subject, but I interpret right to work laws at its core advocating the ultimate destruction of the exclusive bargaining representative that is a labor union. That's what the intent of those laws are. That's why we call it right to work for less. Because eventually, without any financial support, from the members themselves, who are the workers, and being able to be to pay dues, either on a required basis or on a fair share basis. Okay, there's no representation there, and I'm only aware of one state in the country, Florida, in which there is a right to work out of the 28 states, in which a labor organization is not required to represent that non-paying or free rider, as we would call them. Right? The rest of the states, 27 states, they have right to work, but those labor organizations still have to represent those members. That worker gets fired, that union has got to represent them through to an arbitration that could cost thousands of dollars.
No, that's true. I don't disagree with you, except I would say this. It is devastating to post-war labor relations and unions.
To what?
The post-war model of labor relations and unions. There's no doubt about that, but that begs the question. With the post-war model of labor relations in such crisis, is that crisis terminal, and is it now time for unions to think about something else? But I agree with you. The way business has been done since 1937, it's incompatible with that. But maybe that model is in its death throes, and it certainly is in much of the country already. So I'm playing both sides of the issue.
Remember, you had compulsory unionism until the Taft-Hartley Act. So,
You
until
had
47.
To some extent. I mean, even before Taft-Hartley, the board had moved in some ways that sort of limited that. But before that, until 1937, you had really no legal protections. You had the statute in 35, but it was a dead letter until 37. And that was the period of greatest growth in union membership. That and during the war, when it was suspended for wartime, in lieu of wartime measures like the jurisdictional labor board and whatnot. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, I think there's some complicating dynamics here.
I just don't see it right to work being a viable alternative to the worker in America as a free rider receiving the benefits of labor representation.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I'm disappointed in your comments with regard to the comment that I made. It seems to me as though what you are doing is supporting the idea that change can take place through demonstrations, through labor contracts, but not through the law, changing with regard to corporate rule. Because corporate rule is a big problem. I'd say it's one of the themes of today. And you seem to feel as though if it was tried, it wouldn't work.
Well, it hasn't worked till now. I mean, I don't mean to be facetious, but it just, to me, it's strange credulity to think that you could get a constitutional amendment through this Congress and these state legislatures.
Maybe another Congress.
And any time, it hasn't happened until now. It's been 100 years that corporations have been people. And this hasn't been successfully overturned, even when you're dominated by Democrats and
That's what I tried.
I mean, sure it has. People have argued against it. They've argued in court. They've tried to all the time. They've tried to overturn Taft-Hartley. If you can't overturn Taft-Hartley in 70 years, through Democratic Congresses, labor-supported presidents, and all that, it just, to me, seems extremely unlikely that you could enact a constitutional amendment that would overturn the corporate personhood doctrine. Even though I agree with you, that would be a good thing, I just don't think it's going to happen. I think if it happened, it might be eviscerated anyway. And maybe the energies of organized labor and everyone else are better expended on something else. Like maybe changing the political system or changing the underlying dynamics of the political system at least, rather than trying to get an amendment through. I'm not omniscient though, maybe I'm wrong. It just seems unlikely to me, but let me defer to my...
Well, so I mean, I hesitate to, I fear that cynicism often sort of slips into apathy and essentially nihilism, right? Like, and so I hear actually skepticism and cynicism, and I know that that can result in essentially we just, well, game over, right? So like, when I say that, I think, well, let's think about the past, and then let's think about when things actually turned out in a pretty short period of time to be shockingly different than I would have predicted a few years prior. And in fact, history is full of examples where shit was bad, and then things got a lot better or dramatically turned, and you wouldn't have predicted it, right? Like, so I'll just give you one example, right? In the 1860s, if you had told me in 1860 that by 1870 slavery would have been abolished, blacks would have been given equal rights, and black men would have gained the same voting power as white men, I would have said in 1860, no way would that have happened in 10 years, right? But in fact, in the space of 10 years, a terrible war had been fought, but slavery had been abolished, the 14th and 15th Amendment passed, right? Like, but in 1860, no one would have put money on it, right? Like, and so there are other examples, right? But there are many examples, in fact, when radical change has occurred that people fail to predict, right? Because no one can predict the future, but also because, in fact, things happen, and then if you're ready, sometimes you can exact radical change. The Russian Revolution is another good example, right? Like, and so change is possible, radical change is possible. It's happened, right? Like, but it's not common. Right? Like,
Well, it's not common, but also, I mean, keep my point. It's about where you put your energy. Is it in getting a constitutional amendment passed? If what you're trying to do is bring maybe recognition to the issue, to use it as a foil to generate, to accelerate political activism, that's one thing. But if you think that you're going to get an amendment and that'll do the work for you, the Civil War is actually a good example of why that's maybe not a good way to think. Slavery was overthrown at the cost of three-quarters of a million lives. Not because the document was signed. The document was signed because of the war that ended slavery.
Well, and the question I think too is, I might ask you, how do you see defending that kind of legislation? If it's handed to the working class without them struggling for it, you know, it's like, you know, we've got teachers that say, well, why don't we just call the union and have them run their election? Send in 10 organizers and get the card signed and let's have it done. And I'm telling them, look, if that's the way you form the union, you know, unions can be decertified as well as they can be certified. Decert. How do you defend against the decert if you haven't organized people to make the union in the first place? So the question is, how do you fight back when you know inevitably the bourgeoisie, an element of the bourgeoisie, because what you've described is where the class, the employer class, the capitalist class is split, and they one side against the other, like it was during the New Deal, right? You have two different wings of the capitalist class with two different approaches. The Ford fascists, literally Ford fascists, right? And the New Deal liberals. And the question is when the right wing of the bourgeoisie finally gets to overturn that legislation, how do you defend against it if you haven't organized the workers?
I think what you could do are use the examples of the women's movement, civil rights movement. It's on that level, I believe. And
right. So from the bottom up.
yes, that's right.
Right.
And those
Yeah. Okay. Somewhere over here. Yeah.
There was a meeting at Cleveland Marshall School of Law in January about the immigration executive orders that kind of plays to this. There was one of the judges from the federal district, Northern District of Ohio, spoke about it. And he said that all I can do as a judge, and of course this person that has this job for life, right? He said all I can do is rule on what the law is, but if you really want to change things, you have to get out there on the streets. So that's a federal judge saying that.
Yes.
Like, moreover, we talk about changing the system from the bottom up, but you cannot fix a system that is functioning exactly the way it was intended to. It was intended to keep us stuck. These laws were written with this in mind. So no, you can't change it from the bottom up. And we talk about the women's movement, and it's quoted terribly out of context because things haven't changed. Maybe things have changed on paper, but they're not different. Not really. We don't get paid equally. Stay-at-home mothers are estimated to be worth $200 grand a year. You think I make shit? No, I don't make shit. I can't even afford government daycare. So I mean, we talk about fixing something, but you can't fix something when it's working the way it was intended to. You have to fight back against it. You have to take to the streets, talk to people, organize.
Those are important things.
Anybody else?
But it's the only things. I mean, okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, way back.
I think one more point along these lines is also, yes, the legislative fight is important, I think. We can't let that go away. And one important part is we mentioned slavery, right? Slavery exists today in this country. We know it. 13th Amendment allows, if you are convicted of a felony, to use you as a slave, which we do extensively, especially against the African Americans, right? And there, we definitely need to keep the legislative battle going to change that in the Constitution. We can't let that go. On the other side, coming back to you, those other issues, we can't simply change them by making an amendment in the Constitution, because they are so inherently rooted in the system. Unless we destroy the system, unless the capitalist system is gone, we can't accomplish some of those things. They can't be just legislated, because the system itself is keeping them alive. It will never allow us to make those changes. That's how I see it.
Yeah, wow.
Well, we've seen in the film the violent labor activity in the beginning of the century, turn of the century, and we know that in the 30s, there was this vibrant labor movement. And now things have gone way downhill. I mean, I just, will it ever get back to what we saw there with the wobblies? How will it ever get back?
Well, I mean, who knows? But I would say that, the United States of America is just 5% of the world's population, and that actually, if and when revolutions happen, it's not going to happen here, right? Like, because things are too good off for too many people. People might complain some, and there might be just cause, but like actually, there are far more oppressed peoples than those in the United States, and those are the peoples who I would look for. If the answer is yes, it's not going to happen here, right? It's going to happen in India. It's going to happen in Brazil. It's going to happen in places where actually oppression is greater, and therefore people have less to lose, right? Like, and so I don't know if it'll happen in the 21st century, but it's not going to. It will not be the United States that leads this global change, right? It will be actually here people will be resisting the change, like most things.
Tom.
So in answer to that, our job would be to keep our troops out of Brazil.
Yes, and not to sell weapons actually to Saudi Arabia or any other country, so that those state powers can use our weapons against those future uprisings.
Andrew, just quickly, the point about weapons is an important one, because one of the themes running into any discussion of labor, including our own, is repression. Which people ask me all the time, you think things can be like they were in the teens or the 20s or the 30s? Well, if they were, and I agree with Peter that there are other reasons to think that they wouldn't be, but even if they were an impetus, one thing you have to contend with, this is not about being cynical, this is about being realistic, is that the government's capacity for social control is far greater today than it was 100 years ago. And you just have to confront that fact. Doesn't mean you stay home and watch, reruns of Andy Griffith all the time. But it does mean you take a realistic view of what's going on there, the ability to punish people, and the culture, as some of my criminologist friends have put it, the culture of control, the legitimacy of the state in using its authority to keep a lid on things. We saw that right here last summer with the Republican convention. This massive capacity to control people. No, it's not as crude as it was 100 years ago. You just grab a guy like Frank Little and murder him. That seldom happens today along political lines. But the ability of the state to control things is enormous, and you have to think, how do you negotiate? And part of that is a story of weapons.
Yeah, and I would just add that social media hasn't put a dent in that. unfortunately. Maybe it could be an element, but it hasn't done much to stop that. And, yeah, I'm sorry, in back, and then maybe we'll start to conclude.
Ahmed said, a lot of what I was going to say is like, I just came back from Germany yesterday night actually, and the militarization of the police in Germany and elsewhere in Europe is pretty much as bad as here, just different weaponry, but pretty much different flavor, but same thing. But what you see, like even with a guy like Emmanuel Macron, who everybody's thought is the golden boy, well, compared to the alternative he is. But some of the stuff he came up with, and you have a general strike in France. Can you imagine that here? Some of the stuff Trump has pulled in a general strike here. I mean, people here are so used to not doing that. I mean, they have, I think, destroyed things so completely here, that, you have to build that a lot more. And as you said, it's probably going to happen elsewhere, not here.
Okay, it seems to, I'm sorry, okay, one more comment, we'll take one, maybe two more, and then we'll probably end up with, go ahead, Tony.
You talk about building things here, starting in the workplace. I think the example of local aid, I think there are lessons to learn from the example of local aid with solidarity unionism as an alternative form of unionism, right? As we see this labor regime that came out of the New Deal and the National Labor Relations Act hasn't worked real well in the past 40 years, the past 30 years. It's led to the serious decline of unionism. So as we think about alternative unionism, what can local aid teach us on the docks in Philadelphia about how solidarity unionism can get and bring the goods on a daily basis in the workplace? And you made mention of enforcing work rules, not through contracts, right? But through just simply being able to do one-day strikes, 2-hour strikes, right? To enforce the time you start at work and the time you leave. You want to keep us 2 hours late, you can't, because we're just going to walk off the job. So I don't know if you can speak for a minute about that, local aid, and the power they had for that 6 years or so, right, on the job.
Well, I appreciate you coming back to them. I think about it actually slightly differently, but trying to connect up some of these other comments, right? I think local aid was successful for many reasons. Being anti-racist was not their end goal, right? But it was a necessary part of the equation, right? But I would say that another part of it is that you have to achieve short-term gains as well as long-term gains, right? And so I was also thinking about some of Andrew's comments. In my opinion, if you want to organize, you can't sign someone up that says, all right, let's have the revolution tomorrow. No one's going to join that cause. Right? But if you win some victories, right, short-term victories that are sort of basic, like now I make more money than I made last week, now there's a little bit more safety on the job, now maybe I work better, work clear hours. I think those very sort of bread and butter issues, which local aid was often criticized for by others in IWW for local aid not being too revolutionary or not revolutionary enough, right? Was one of the reasons they were successful, right? That you have to be fighting now, because I don't want to suffer and I don't want my fellow workers to suffer, but also sort of with having long-term vision. So the contemporary labor movement has no long-term vision, right? Their vision is more of whatever I have now, tomorrow, right? But local aid, as a part of a larger organization's vision, was much bigger, right? So I think you need to organize for short-term gains, whatever workers in that place need or want. And you need to sort of link that to always larger goals and longer-term strategies. And so I think that folks like Fletcher, for instance, according to James Fair, that person who's interviewed in this film, speaks in sort of general terms, right? That he would talk about solidarity as a sort of for short-term benefits, but also to achieve long-term goals. And I think, in my opinion, and also sort of speaking to some of the comments in the back, I think that's essential, right? Because if the goal is to build your organization, which seems to be the one conclusion that everyone agrees upon in this room, that you have to, how do you organize? You can't organize for a revolution tomorrow, right? People are skeptical that that's going to happen, so they're not going to join, right? And so, but if you're saying, we're going to make your life better now, that actually has tangible benefits. But then you don't just stop there, right? Like, you know, you have much longer, hopefully larger visions. And I think that, I don't know if that's quite what you were asking about, Tony, but that's what I was sort of thinking about. That's one of the reasons I believe that it was both durable, but also radical, right? Because that doesn't have to be contradictory, right?
Yeah, I think maybe what we're talking about is transitional demands. Some people, some parts of the international left, Trotskyists in particular, some of them talked about transitional demands, as opposed to ultimatism that we see, you know, be it public square, May 1st, and the revolution will begin. So one more comment here, okay?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of follow up and piggyback on what you said behind me, and that, and I would raise a point with you that even within traditional unions, it's not necessarily the majority, but I've noticed, I mean, I'm a trade unionist in a building trade union, which is excruciatingly conservative sometimes, but I am seeing a shift. I am seeing a shift, and I actually do some labor education classes with their apprentices. You're starting to see a shift to where people are coming in and they know that the social contract has been broken. The success of those post-New Deal era National Labor Relations Act, type of legislation, they're seeing that legislation has been raked back. It's not working anymore. They're not enjoying the same social contract that their parents enjoyed or their grandparents. And they are starting to take a left turn. I honestly am starting to see a shift, especially with young apprentices, to where they are open to, ideas of socialism, communism. I don't interject that directly into the apprenticeship class. People will have problems with that, obviously, but in a roundabout way, I try to introduce that type of solidarity, unionism, political awareness, and those type of things, and instill that, and to let them understand that it's not your leaders that are going to gain you the concessions that you want. It's going to have to be you and the person sitting next to you.
I would just say two things. I agree what you say. One, pick your movement, right? Women's movement was taken. How many women were a part of it? Hundreds of thousands of women, right? How many people are there in America? There were tens of millions of women, right? Like African-American civil rights. Tens of millions of blacks. How many people were in the movement? You only need 1%, right? Like, so you need an activist minority in any organization. Most people might be supportive, but they'll follow, right? Like, so you need activists. So minority unionism is a great, concept because it's been proven time and again. The second thing I would say is that education, most unions are bad at it, including, ironically, the teachers union. The AFT has no educational component, but you don't know why you're joining them, right? The union I studied, Local 10, right? What did the activist who helped lead the anti-apartheid struggle in Local 10 do? He went into educating his, essentially the newcomers. They didn't call them apprentices. Right, so they require education, right? All people who want to become full members of the union have to take a certain amount of these classes, right? And so it's essential, right? Like the IWW's, the three things on my belt, right? Education, organization, emancipation, right? Like, and so it's too many of us forget it, right? Like the trade union movement has not been good at it. Some people are, so it's great. That's the great example, right, of what can be done right now.
So, brother, I'd like to meet you afterwards, and thank you very much. We'll end on that positive note. And I think we're pretty much at the end of our fourth LaborFest, and we thank you all for attending. And I would just like to ask you, if you do want to lead membership or purchase one of Peter's books or any other Wilding material, please meet us in the alley out back. Actually, where we are parked is right at Superior, and Tom, are you in the room? I think right at the corner here, 6. And I'm very serious about that. We want to maintain our good relationships with the library. They've been wonderful to us in providing this great venue. And so thank you very much. And we will join us and help us continue this tradition.